Hello, welcome back to Learn Astrology with Mary. My name's Mary English, and today we have a special guest. We have Chris, and he is Chris Mitchell, and he lives in Leicester. Is that right, Chris?
That's right.
Super. And now the reason I got to know Chris is that I live in Bath, and Chris used to live in Bristol. Is that right?
That's right, in Bristol.
And he was running the Bristol group of astrology, and I think somebody had emailed him and asked him about indigos, and he forwarded that email on to me, and I helped the person. So that was my first, because he'd heard about the research that time. So that was our first meeting, and I think we eventually met at one of the local groups, one of the Bath ones possibly.
I think it was the Bath one, yeah.
Yeah, so we've known each other for a while, but the funny thing was, Chris did a reading for me, and he came to the house, and he said something like us being twins before he came. I thought, whatever's he talking about? And then when he turned up, it's like, oh my God, he's the Pisces, the Leo ascendant. We are astrological twins because our birthdays were only a few days apart. So it's like, oh, crazy moment. So Chris is on the board of the Astrological Association. He's just finished his PhD in medieval astrology. So today we're speaking to somebody that is an expert in medieval astrology. And the title of his PhD is, he says it's rather provocatively titled, is England's First Astrology Book. And I think it's actually called Roger of Hereford's Judicial Astrology, England's First Astrology Book, yeah? He says it's rather a long read and rather dry, but it's an interesting concept. And he also says, so we know the Greeks could do astrology and draw up charts 2,000 years ago, and because the Roman Empire incorporated Greece, the Hellenistic Greek astrology became the norm across the Roman Empire. It had 12 signs of the zodiac, ones we use today, and that we know enough, and 7 of the planets that we still use, with similar keywords: Saturn's grumpy, Jupiter's jolly. However, after the decline of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, astrology declined too. And with a few hundred years, although we still knew that Mars was warlike and Jupiter was generous, we'd lost the ability to do all the complicated calculations that, how do you say, is it Ptolemy? I never get his name right.
Ptolemy.
Ptolemy, thank you. Ptolemy wrote about, and thereby actually drawing up a chart. In fact, we didn't even know who Ptolemy was anymore, or Aristotle, or most of the Greek writers, and astrology was in the doldrums. And then in the year 999, isn't that a nice year?
Brilliant.
A brilliant scholar called Herbert, pronounce it for me.
Gerbert d'Aurillac.
Oh, listen to that. Became Pope Sylvester II. He was widely travelled and adventured into Islamic Spain, where he discovered that Arabic science was pretty well advanced compared to Christian Europe, and had various texts and instruments, including something called an astrolabe, the medieval equivalent of a smartphone. And I've got a podcast about astrolabes. I think they're wonderful. He introduced this instrument into Christian Europe and prompted the study of science and astrology. It's a little ironic, given that the Catechism of the Catholic Church thoroughly condemns astrology. I know, because I was born a Catholic. This is because the Catechism is not an ancient document. It was written by Pope John Paul II in 1992. So this official condemnation is very recent. The Church was using and even promoting astrology in parts of the medieval period. So it's quite a long introduction, so I'm going to stop there for a moment, and I'm just going to come forwards to now. So you've put here, so let's see what's happening in the Severn Valley in a small city called Hereford on the English-Welsh border. The cathedral there had a school. Many cathedrals did have schools, but many of them focused on teaching boys how to sing in the choir, but a few also taught a wider range of subjects. The one at Hereford taught science, mathematics, and astrology. Yeah. We don't know how old the kids or boys at the school were, but they were probably around 13 or 14. They would have been clever. They had to know Latin grammar, oh my Lord, to be at the school, and probably from reasonably wealthy families. Their teacher, Roger, was teaching them astrology. The text he was using had only recently been translated from Arabic into Latin. So to make it easier for the students, he decided to compile all the techniques he learned from those texts into a single volume, which is why I call it England's First Astrology Book. Why is astrology so cool? Asks Roger to his young students. Because it lets you see into the future and gives you power over people. Oh, I thought it like that. And you can see how it might have been appealing to a young teenager. He knew how to get their attention. So welcome, Chris. It's a wonderful subject we're going to be discussing today. So the ancient astrologers only used the earlier planets, only went up as far as Saturn, obviously. So what is medieval astrology?
Well, thank you for inviting me, Mary. It's lovely to be interviewed by you. And as you said, we've known each other for many, many years. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know about you, but when I was at school in the 60s, in primary school, we were kind of taught that you had all these amazing civilizations like the Egyptians and then the Roman Empire. And then the Roman Empire kind of fell to bits and nothing happened for 1,000 years. When the Renaissance came along and we all became civilized again. It was like somebody had turned out the lights for 1,000 years. Okay, if you're English, it's a bit different because something happened in 1066 and we had to talk about the Norman invasion. But other than that, it was called the Dark Ages. Not a lot happened between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. If you're an astrologer, actually all the interesting stuff happened in that dark period because it wasn't really dark at all. What happened is the Roman Empire had astrology kind of as we know it. Saturn was the grumpy old man, Jupiter was like your favourite uncle. All the keywords that we associate with planets today were there. They had the 12 signs of the zodiac. And this knowledge was there. They knew how to draw up charts. If you spoke to an ancient Greek astrologer, it wouldn't be that different to the astrology that you and I are doing today with our clients. I mean, there are some differences, but all the stuff that we know and love, that's where it came from. It was there in Greek astrology. That found its way into the Roman Empire, and it was there in the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. What did happen, though, is once the Roman Empire got Christianized, they got a bit suspicious of astrology because it was pagan. And we still see this today. The Catholic Church doesn't like astrology. If you look on Islamic websites, they don't like astrology. It's considered haram. If you go and see an astrologer, you're not allowed into the mosque for a month. Jewish Orthodox Judaism tends to be very down on astrology. They take the interesting position that it works, but you shouldn't be using it, which is quite interesting. But we have this idea that the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, really don't like astrology. It's bad, it's pagan, and you should leave it alone. It wasn't always like that, though. Although the early Christian church was suspicious of anything pagan, it wasn't astrology as such that they were opposed to. It was pagan teachings and heresy and things like that. So in the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian, and the Roman Empire had more or less collapsed in the West by then, but it was still going strong in Byzantium, which is modern-day Turkey and Istanbul and around there. Mm-hmm. The Emperor Justinian got rid of all the scholars. He didn't like the idea of this stuff being taught, not just astrology, but philosophy and anything that smacked of paganism. So a lot of those scholars ended up in Persia. They went east. The Persian Empire was much more sympathetic to astrology, so they studied there. But about 100 years after that, the mighty Muslim armies invaded Persia and took it over. This was the biggest empire of its time, and they were defeated by this relatively small Muslim army. Mm-hmm. And Islam then swept across Arabia, Persia, all across northern Africa. And by the 8th century, it got into Spain as well, and most of Spain was under Muslim control. And the Arabs, rather than saying, oh, look at all this pagan stuff, we better burn it, said, well, this pagan stuff's quite interesting. There's some good engineering stuff in here. There's some good scientific stuff. And it helped them win wars. You know, if you know how to build a good catapult and you know the maths behind it, that's going to give you an advantage over your enemies. So
did they also, sorry to interrupt, but did they also find astrology useful because then you might be able to predict when's the best time to have a war? I mean, because the original Babylonians were going, oh, you know, this is a good time for the king to go and boff someone. Did they do a similar thing then?
They did exactly that, yeah. So you have these Arabic authors that were taking these ancient Greek texts in many cases, sometimes Persian. They also had Indian texts that had come in, and they translated them all into Arabic. And the interesting thing is, you might think an Islamic empire would be strictly Muslim, but a lot of the people doing the translations were Persians, and so they were Zoroastrians, or Jews. And for example, when the Caliph al-Mansur in the 8th century decided he was going to found his new capital city of Baghdad as the centre of learning, he got a committee of astrologers together and said, tell me when the best time to lay the foundation stone is.
Wow.
And they came up with a date and a time. And one of the people on there, one of the lead astrologers, was a chap called Masha Allah, which sounds like a very Muslim name, but actually Masha Allah was a Persian Jew. So the
Okay.
foundation stone of Baghdad was laid by a Jewish astrologer, not by a Muslim one. But they were all working in this Islamic milieu. So the day-to-day language of Jews and Persians um, in those days, in the 8th
Hmm.
century, would have been Arabic. They were writing in Arabic, they were speaking Arabic, and that was where all the fun was happening. They'd taken all these Greek texts, they translated them into Arabic, and they were actually practicing astrology. And they were doing things like, when's the best time to go to war? They were asking horary questions like, okay, when's the best time to buy and sell my slave? Or, who stole my property and where is it? So all the
Mm.
sort of things that horary astrologers were doing a few, hundreds of years, nearly 1,000 years later, were there. And this is where astrology really got honed. We have all this Greek astrology with its 12 signs and 7 planets.
Mm.
We got a few Persian things coming in, like Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, marking out periods of time. We got some
Heart of
Indian
Fortune, that
astrology.
was then or not?
Yeah, the Greeks had that they called it the lot of
North
fortune, but it was the same thing.
North Node, did they have that?
Yep, the Greeks had the north and south nodes as well, so did the Arabs.
Okay.
So they were taking this Greek astrology, but they weren't just translating it, thinking, well, here's some text, we'll translate them, but we don't know what to do with them. They were translating them because they were using them. And this went on really from about 700 right up until the 1100s, even the 1200s.
So it
And
lasted a long
so
time
it did
then.
last a long time. The thing that kind of changed it is there was some major climate change that happened in the 12th century that disrupted a lot of these big centres of learning. And of course, you had the Mongol hordes invading as well,
Mm.
absolutely devastated. I mean, they destroyed Baghdad, so a lot of these centres of learning kind of collapsed after that. But
Mm.
Islamic astrology was still going on right up until the Ottoman Empire in the 20th century.
Mm.
So it was all taking place, but the height of the Islamic Empire, I'd say, was probably about 1,000 years ago. And this is where you have loads and loads of astrology texts, and you have people like Masha Allah and Sal ibn Bishr, and well, you have a lot of scientists as well. I mean, there was one chap called Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, because he came
How do
from
you
an
even
area.
remember that name? I can barely remember my husband's surname.
Well, it's always the person's name, a son of somebody from so and so. So you might
Oh,
be Mary, son of John from Bath.
right, got
Um,
you. Mhm.
so this guy was from an area called Khwarazm, which is in modern day Afghanistan,
Okay.
and he was a fantastic scholar. And he wrote a book called Kitab al-Jabr, which means the book of combinations, and that's where we get the word algebra from, because it was the first algebra book.
Okay.
The Arabs took Indian numbers.
Hmm.
We were using Roman numerals right up until the 13th century. They had
Okay.
0, 1, 2, 3, etc., up to 9. The numbers that you and I use today are
Yeah.
actually Arabic numerals. They're not.
Is it?
That's where they came from. Well, they came from India, and the Arabs adapted them a little bit. And
Okay.
this Al Khwarizmi bloke is also uh, wrote astronomical treatises and how do we actually work out where the planets are. And he adapted the Greek tables that they were using because they were getting a bit out of date and the calculations were a little bit out. So all your planets were a few degrees out. So he
Right.
adapted it and changed it so you could do chart calculation again.
Hmm.
And Latin writers had great difficulty translating Arabic names because they're quite unpronounceable. So Al-Khwarizmi became algorithmus in Latin, and that's where we get the word algorithm from. And anyone that does any computer programming will know that an algorithm is a set of instructions. It's a computer program, is an algorithm.
Mm.
So the Arab influence on modern science is absolutely huge.
Enormous by
Now
the
you
sound
might
of it.
think, why on earth were how did this come to Europe? It was all very
Mm.
well the Arabs are doing things, but something happened in the 12th century, and it all suddenly exploded, and all these Arabic texts got translated into Latin. So we had a kind of 12th century Renaissance. So right in the middle of this so-called Dark Age, massive stuff was going on in Europe, and
Mhm.
that's when we rediscovered astrology.
Okay, but what sparked it? Was it a person leading it, or I don't know, the weather conditions, or what would be the spark?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question. What happened is this chap I was mentioning earlier, Gerbert d'Aurillac, was a
Oh yes.
fantastic scholar, um, and he was really interested in astrology. He went to Islamic Spain. He learnt how to use something called an astrolabe, which was like a little map of the heavens. I don't know if you've
Oh
ever
yeah,
seen
yeah.
those
I've got one.
planisphere.
Hold it. I've got to show
Oh, you've
everyone.
got one.
I'm so proud. I've not told you. Let me grab it. 1 minute. I am so chuffed that I got this. I did a whole podcast on it, and I even did a YouTube video and a Facebook thingy. So that's what he looks like here, like that. She says, speaking like a local. And then this little filler moves around, and that bit, everything shifts. Okay, so all of these things shifty around like that. And what you do is you start on the outside, and you do your date of birth. So we've got the months of the year. I mean, this is the easy version here. So we've got the months of the year round like that. So I'm born on the 5th of March. So I go to March and I move it to the nearest I can to get it to 5. And it's pretty accurate. Okay, so this little funny little thing like this. So I put the 5th of March, and then it tells me that I'm a Pisces. So that bit is there's Pisces. And then you have to read the degree of my sun sign, which is 15 degrees. And then you turn over to here. And then you do the time of day. I think it's the time of day you add in, and then it will find your ascendant. And on there also is all the stars. So it's not just astrology. They did quite a lot more with stars than
they could use it for navigating. They used it for working out which direction Mecca was in. And they also used it as a clock, because clocks weren't very accurate in those days. But what you could do is look out of the window if it's a sunny day, and it usually was in Arabic countries, and you could use that little thing on the astrolabe and go, where's the sun? There we go. The sun is at an elevation of 23 degrees at the moment. And then they would do that on the other side. If you turn it round, they would then move. Okay, we know the sun is at 23 degrees. We know that it's at, 16 of Pisces or whatever on that particular day. So they just move it around, and then they could read it off and say, oh, look, it must be 10 o'clock in the morning because the sun's at that elevation and that's where it is.
Exactly.
So
and
they
then
could
they'd
use
also
it to tell the time.
Because this, what I loved so much about it, and I got so excited when I got, because this one's set for London and I actually live in Bath. It's not that inaccurate. And I did it's like, oh, it comes up with my Leo ascendant. It was like, I was going, confirmation.
They had a whole series of plates. You can take a real metal astrolabe, you can take it to bits, and one of the is called a latitude plate. So it doesn't matter if you're in London or Bath or northern Canada, the astrolabe will work. It's the latitude that's important, because you can just do your adjustment. Bath is the same as London, but minus about 8 minutes. So you can just move things along like that. But if you were in southern Spain, that astrolabe wouldn't work. You'd need a different latitude plate. So they would give you a set
down
of them,
the map.
and they would just simply take one out and put another one in, and then it would work. So when they started moving to, you got scholars moving up to France and London, they would just change the latitude plate and their astrolabe would still work. It really was the medieval equivalent of a smartphone.
They are so marvellous. I went to London to the British Museum and they had a special exhibition on, and it was all about Arabia. I mean, it's not called that, but the Arab countries. And they had the world. I went there I only went with my smartphone, but I'm taking pictures of these enormous astrolabes.
Yes.
And they're beautiful, and they are so beautiful. They really, really are pretty. And they've got all these numbers on them and these calculations. And you think, bloody hell, there's us saying, that ancient civilizations weren't so bright. Excuse my French, what a load of rubbish. Because they were just geniuses. And they were really, really pretty. And some of them, and they're made out of valuable whatever. And you think, well, I wouldn't be able to afford one of those. You'd have to be some sort of high up. You'd have to be a rich person to own an astrolabe, surely, I'm sure. And mine's made of balsa wood.
We don't really know. I mean, the ones that you see in museums, and Oxford is the best one, the history of Museum of the History of Science, and they've got all their astrolabe collection online as well. They're all made of brass. They would have been really, really, really expensive. But when you read the textbooks, the assumption is that everyone doing astrology had an astrolabe, and they probably had them made out of wood, and we don't have any examples of those because they would have rotted away.
Rotted,
or made out of not paper, parchment and things like that. I've got one made out of PVC and cardboard. Well, that's not going to last 1,000 years, but the bronze ones will do. So it probably was more accessible than we think, but we haven't got examples of those, because you can make cheap equivalents of them out of by carefully cutting out parchment. A bit of a labour of love, but not expensive to make if you've got the basic one.
No, and when I did the particular podcast about the astrolabe, I put links to if you want to make one out of cardboard.
Yes,
There's
yeah.
there's various. And I was that month that I was doing and thinking about astrolabes and stuff. The amount of information that I found about it is not that much. But the people that have researched them are terribly into them, and they've got the info and whatever. And that's how I accidentally found this chappie on Etsy. Unfortunately, he was retired. I just don't think he's alive anymore. His Etsy page hasn't been updated since
No,
October.
I looked at the link you sent me, and I can't see them for sale anymore, which is a shame because they look lovely, and I would like to buy
Well,
one.
what I might do is send him a message, because I can message him from my, well, I've got an Etsy account to see, just
Yeah.
to check he's still alive, because I know he was getting on a bit and he was doing them as a labour of love.
Yeah.
But I'll get hold of him.
Well, no, that would be lovely. I'd love to buy one of those. But anyway, this chap Jeber visited Islamic Spain, studied these Arabic sciences, and he is supposedly responsible for bringing the astrolabe into Christian Europe. And he was in a position to do it because he became Pope. So when you think,
big job, yeah.
Churches don't approve of astrology, we have a Pope to thank for reintroducing astrology into Europe. But we still had a bit of a missing link. Some of this stuff started coming in from the Arab world from the 10th century onwards. And by the 11th century, imagine that you're at the coronation of William the Conqueror. It's Christmas Day in London, 1066. And you're a budding astrologer. And now you've got all these texts, some of which have been translated into Latin. You've got a book called the thesis, which was written by Firmicus Maternus. He was a Hellenistic astrologer in the Roman Empire in the 5th century. And he's telling you that if you've got Mercury in the 3rd house, that will make you a magician or an astrologer. All the stuff that we would recognise today. No modern astrologer would be surprised to hear that if you've got Mercury in the 3rd house, you're going to be a good astrologer. This book that was available told you that. But the problem was you didn't know how to do chart calculations. To work out where your Mercury is, you need to be able to do planetary calculations. They didn't have an ephemeris in those days. They didn't have any way of working it out. So it's like, I wonder if I'm going to be a good astrologer. Where's your Mercury? Haven't got a clue. It's not going to be too far from the sun, but my sun's in Pisces, as yours is. Where's my Mercury? Well, if I didn't have an ephemeris, I wouldn't know. It might be Aries, it might be Aquarius, it might be Pisces. It's not going to be too far from my sun, but it makes a big difference whether your Mercury is in Aquarius or Aries.
Absolutely.
So it was useless. You didn't know which house it was in. You might just about be able to work out the ascendant, although that was a bit fiddly as well if you didn't have a book of calculations. They didn't know how to do it. So you're an astrologer, and it's and you're looking at the coronation of William the Conqueror. Well, you do know where the sun is. People knew that. And one thing that the Christian church had to do, even in the very early days, was they did need to be able to work out when full moons are, because Easter is based on the Jewish festival of Passover. The Gospels say that Christ was crucified on the eve of Passover. Passover is a Jewish festival, and the Jewish calendar to this day is a lunar one. So when you see this tiny little sliver of a new moon, that's the start of a new Jewish month. But everything happens to happen in the right season. So to keep the seasons in sync, every 2 or 3 years, they add on a 13th month.
The Jewish calendar does.
On the Jewish calendar.
Yeah.
So we do know that Passover is always on the 15th day of the month, and that means it's a full moon. So Passover is always the first full moon of spring. That's the rule for Passover. So Christians needed to know that because they needed to celebrate Easter on the Sunday after the full moon, so that it was the right time to celebrate Christ's death. And if you're Christian, as you know, being brought up a good Catholic, Mary, you have to suffer 40 days of Lent beforehand, where you have to give something up. So you can't just look out of the window as Muslim clerics do now and say, I can see the crescent moon in Mecca, it's the start of a month. You needed at least 40 days notice of Easter so you could commemorate Lent. So that meant that they had to be able to do those calculations with the sun and moon to work out when the full moon was going to be. So you're an astrologer in 1066. You know how to work out where the sun is. You know how to work out where the moon is. Or if you don't, you can ask a friendly local monk to do it for you, because they're used to these sort of things. You've probably got a rough idea where Jupiter and Saturn were, because they move quite slowly, and you can see Jupiter in the sky and say, well, a couple of months ago it was up in Sagittarius or whatever, so it's probably still going to be there. It only moves one sign a year. The same with Saturn. As for Mars and Mercury, you really haven't got a clue unless you happen to look up and see it in the night sky. You don't really know where it is at any particular date. You couldn't do your birth chart because you couldn't work out where Mars was when you were born. Venus, possibly, but we haven't got any evidence that they could work that out, although that is a lot more regular. So you're an astrologer and you cast the chart for William the Conqueror's coronation, and you discover that you have the sun on the midheaven because it was at noon, and you've got what have you got rising? You've got Aries rising. So it's a Mars-ruled chart, but you don't know where Mars is. So you can't do any proper astrology. It must have been so frustrating.
But why would they even be interested in astrology if they couldn't make those calculations? Sorry, you're going to obviously tell us.
Well, because they were reading these books that told them all that, and they knew there was some hidden foreign knowledge. This mystical Arabic stuff had been translated into Latin, and it's like you've got a magic book full of spells, and it tells you all you need to do is mix together so and so and so and so. You think, I don't know what they are. I don't know where to get them from. They had this recipe book of really fascinating astrological stuff. Do you want to know what your career is going to be? Of course you do. You know, are you going to be a good astrologer? Are you going to be a good magician? Are you going to be a good doctor? Are you going to be a good priest or whatever? Well, yeah, this book will tell you, but you can't do the calculations, so you can't get the answer. Really frustrating stuff. And then what happened is in the 12th century, in the late 11th century, in 1085, Toledo fell to the Christians. Now, Toledo is a beautiful city in Spain. It's near Madrid. You can go there. Well, you can't go there today because of the lockdown.
No, because the lockdown, yeah.
I was planning to go this year. It's a lovely city. And it was a centre of Islamic learning. But it fell to the Christians, and the King of Castile, the northern bit of Spain that wasn't under Muslim control, took it over. Now, normally when Christians took over Muslim cities, they would throw out all the Arabs and all the Muslims that were there and throw out all the Jews that were there. But the King of Castile was quite unusual. He had a Muslim wife and he encouraged scholarship. So the Jews and the Muslims that were already there in Toledo, he allowed them to stay. Christian scholars travelled from all over Europe and went to Toledo, and they learnt Arabic, often with the help of Jewish intermediaries, because we weren't a very multicultural society in Europe in those days. We definitely didn't have any people who were openly Muslim living in Christian Europe, but we did have Jewish communities in Christian Europe, and a lot of these Jews had moved from Muslim countries into Christian Europe, so they could speak Arabic, they could read it, and they could teach Christians Arabic, which is quite handy. So they had all these texts that were written in Arabic, and Christian scholars were able to translate them into Latin, which was a language that every scholar in Christian Europe could read.
Yes.
So Latin was the universal language of Christendom in those days. So now we suddenly have these texts coming in, masses of texts, mathematical texts, medical texts, and astrological texts. And
so what did they do? Stick them on boats to get the books there? Where did these texts come from?
The routes, we're not quite sure, but we know that they came across the Pyrenees into France from Spain. And we had a very strange thing going on in the West Country in the 11th and 12th centuries. The West Country's always been a little bit different from everybody else.
Has it really now?
It has.
My lover.
And there was the area that we now call Alsace-Lorraine on the French-German border. It's where you get all the nice German white wines from there, Strasbourg and all that kind of area. That area is now known as Lorraine, but it used to be known as Lotharingia. And Lotharingia had this fascination with Arabic science that went back a very long way, possibly back as far as the Roman Empire. And a lot of Lotharingians ended up in the West Country. So you had the Bishop of Hereford in the early 1100s, was Robert of Losinga. He was a Lotharingian. Walcher, who was the Prior of Malvern, he was a Lotharingian, and they had this interest in Arabic science, and they promoted it in the cathedral schools in the West Country. And the Prior of Malvern had an astrolabe. He was interested in science, but he was also wanted to know how to work out where the planets were. Nobody knew at the time, but a Jewish convert who had been brought up in Spain, so he spoke Arabic, and he'd read these Arabic texts. called Petrus Alfonsi. That was his the name that he chose once he became a Christian. Worked with the prior of Malvern, with Walcher, and translated some of those tables that the Al-Khwarizmi guy that I mentioned earlier had drawn up, and he translated those into Latin. So, working together, they produced the first set of tables in England, and that was in
like
Malvern.
an ephemeris, yeah.
Kind of. It's if you think about an ephemeris that you've got today, like the 20th century ephemeris and the 21st century ephemeris, you've got 365 days in a year, and it goes on for 100 years. So you've got 36,500 days that your ephemeris that easily fits on your bookshelf has got. It's in quite small print, and it's got, well, today it's got all the planets up to Pluto, the moon's nodes, and so on. If you work that out, you multiply that 36,500 by 10. Well, it's more than that because you've got the nodes and everything else. You end up with about 500,000 entries in your ephemeris. Now imagine writing down 500,000 entries on some parchment and having to copy it all by hand.
No, and not even having a fountain pen. You've got to keep dipping it back into the bloody bottle. Yeah.
It couldn't be done. So they had much simpler shorter tables. They were still about 180 pages long. I mean, there were a lot of them. And it was still really difficult to get these tables, but you then had to do a set of horrifically complicated calculations. You had to be good at maths. I'm not going to go
that would have ruled me right out. Yeah.
But I'll just tell you the starting point.
Go on.
The starting point for these tables is they said, okay, on the day of the Hijra, which was when Muhammad left Mecca to go to, when Muhammad moved from from Mecca to Medina. That date, which was 640 something, where were the planets at that particular position? And all the tables started off with that. And they said, this is where the planets were on that day.
Okay.
Right. What's the day today? Well, it's 1066, for example. So the first question they said was, all right, how many days has it been since the Hijra? 400 years. Well, just working that out, you can see how to do it on your fingers. You go, well, okay, May the 2nd, May the 3rd, May the 4th, but you'd have to have tens of thousands of fingers to be able to calculate that. That was your starting point. Wow. And then you said, well, given that we know that Mercury moves so many degrees a day, you multiply that by that number. So they were having to do really complicated calculations. It would have taken days to have calculated a chart. But
so did they have they didn't have anywhere, because the Babylonians were actually looking up at the sky and recording and writing stuff down. So these medieval poor flipping astrologers, they had none of that because our clouds and sky and aren't so visible. So they were relying on the Arabic text with your chappy and the date from that. Really?
Well, you could still do horary astrology, which is somebody comes to see you tonight and says, I've lost my wedding ring, where is it? And if it's a clear night, you could look out there and say, well, okay, I know where the planets are because I can see them. So you could do a certain amount of that, and you could have a pretty good stab at where Mars was because it's a cloudy night tonight, but you saw it 3 days ago and you knew where it was then. So you can kind of do an approximate one, but natal astrology, you can't really look back in time and say, where were the planets when I was born?
Exactly.
So for natal astrology or electional astrology, when's the best time to lay the foundation stone for my new capital city? You don't know where Mars is going to be in 3 years' time without the tables. So the prior of Malvern, and notice a prior, so a good Roman Catholic, was doing this astrology with a Jewish guy who'd converted to Christianity. Now that wasn't bad, but Walcher couldn't really speak Arabic very well. He was helped by Petrus Alfonsi. So onto the scene comes somebody who lives in your fair city, Mary, in Bath. And Adelard of Bath was born in the late 1000s, so probably born round about the time that William the Conqueror invaded. It's a very Saxon name. It's not a Norman name. Adelard is a very Saxon name, but he was obviously quite well off and quite well in with the court. And he wrote books on falconry, which tended to be only rich people that did falconry. He records playing a musical instrument, a cithara, for the Queen. So there was, he was obviously quite well off. And he decided to go to Sicily and learn some Arabic stuff because the Muslims had taken over Sicily. So going to Italy was easy enough. That was a Christian country. Sicily was Christian by this time, but he was able to learn some Arabic. But he then went on to Syria and studied Arabic really seriously, and then he came back and translated a load of astrological texts as well as doing a new set of tables, and
And
he
where were the
drew up
astrological
horoscopes.
texts from?
Well, he got them from Syria,
Right.
and one of the ones that he did was a chap called Abu Mashar wrote this huge influential text on astrology, an Arabic guy, and in the 9th century. And Abu Mashar, this vast book on astrology, has only just been translated into English last year.
Whoa.
And if you happen to have 300 quid to spare, you can
No
buy a copy
thanks.
of it.
It's not on the Wayback Machine on the Internet Archive. Nobody's
No,
taken a
no, no.
photocopy of it. Right.
No, it's a publisher based in Holland called Brill, and they really are very expensive. But because even in those days it was a huge text, Abu Mashar wrote a handy introduction to it, which was like a pocket guide, and
Okay.
that said, "This is what the planets are, this is what the signs are, this is what they mean," and it was just a simple little reference guide. And Adelard of Bath translated that into Latin. So his abbreviation to the introduction was there. And he also drew up a load of horoscopes. Adelard probably was close to Henry I, and he definitely taught the young prince Henry II, and he taught him astrology. And Henry II was living in Bristol at the time. So the Bristol and Bath have got this really ancient connection with astrology. Adelard of Bath was teaching astrology to the future king.
Whoa, flipping
And
heck. Don't do that now, do
I
they?
know. So that would be 1130s, 1140s, something like that. So we suddenly had this flood of texts coming in that were now in Latin.
Right.
And lots and lots of them. We had Abu Mashar, we had Al-Kabisi, who wrote an introduction to astrology. So there were all these techniques, and they were all in loads of different texts. And remember, in those days, texts couldn't be photocopied or printed. They all had to be written out by hand.
Yeah, and somebody'd make a mistake while they were translating it as well, which I know is what happened to the Bible. I read a fabulous book about the Bible, and that things
Absolutely,
would
yeah.
get wrongly translated or wrongly written down when they copied the copy of it. Yeah.
And Abu Mashar was a classic example of that, because you had two people that were translating it. There was John of Seville, who did a very accurate translation, and there was Herman of Corinthia, who tended to paraphrase it rather than translate it. So his version was much shorter. So we have, but the interesting thing is that although these scholars came from all over Europe, England seems to have been overrepresented with these scholars. We have Robert of Ketton, which is in Rutland. We have Roger of Hereford from Hereford. We have the Prior of Malvern, Adelard of Bath, John of Salisbury. There were a lot of English scholars going over there. So it's
And did they all
quite
chat with
interesting.
each other when they got back? Were they all going over there at the same time ish?
Well, Charles Burnet thinks there was this circle of what he calls West Midlands scholars. His definition of West Midlands is quite wide because it includes Bath, and I'm not sure you would count Bath as the West Midlands, but Charles Burnet reckons there was this circle of scholars that included Adelard of Bath and working their way up the Severn to Hereford, Malvern. There were other scholars in that area as well, and they were probably all working together. And one of the people that possibly came into this circle was a rabbi called Abraham ibn Ezra. Now, Ibn Ezra was born in Spain, in Islamic Spain. He would have spoken Arabic, and he would have been familiar with Arabic texts. He was a rabbi, and he had a pretty rough early life. I think his wife died, and he had 5 children, and several of them died, and one of them converted to Islam, so he wasn't too happy about that. So he decided to go wandering after this. He lost touch with all his family. They'd either died or converted to Islam. So he ended up going into France, to Béziers, and at that time there were a couple of English scholars there who were working on a translation of the Quran at the behest of a bishop. That was to try and convert Muslims to Christianity. And they were working on some astrological texts as well. And he apparently met them, and then he ended up moving all over Europe, and he ended up in London. Some rumours say that he died in London when he was quite old, so he ended up settling in England. We don't know exactly where he lived, but he definitely ended up in England and was in London for a while. And it seems likely that he would have met some of these scholars. So people like he was probably a little bit before Roger of Hereford's time, but some of these translators that bring the text over, yes, he would have been talking to them. They would have known each other.
I mean, would they
So
have like sort of conferences or something? Or I'm just going because we can communicate online now. It's just how we
yes,
communicate. But then, if you wanted to go and see somebody in a different city, you had to get on a horse or you had to
absolutely.
get in a carriage, and you can't travel overnight to do that. That's quite a few
No.
days worth of travel. I mean, we're talking about the UK, which is a diddly little country, but we've got a lot of people listening to the podcast that live in America, enormous
Mm.
country. To go from one place to other, that's that's going to take you a while.
Mm.
So you wonder whether or not they had sort of conferences or like send them a letter first, maybe. I don't know.
Well,
But yeah.
they had plenty of spare time. If you think about it, Adelard
Oh,
of Bath ended up going to Syria, and he
mm,
came home again and wrote a set of letters to his nephew.
mm,
And then he went away again 7 years later to Syria.
mm.
So, and they were travelling to Spain, they were travelling to Sicily, they were travelling all over the place. So,
But
um,
where did they get the money to do that? How did the Adelaide of Bath chappie? What did he get his dosh?
well, he was playing the cithara in the court of the Queen, so he probably
Okay,
had a bob or two.
right. Okay.
So they were quite well off, and they were often sponsored. I mean, the various bishops would
Mhm.
pay scholars to travel and bring these
Right.
texts back. So you've got to remember they were very much supported by the church. This is why we find it odd today. The
Mhm.
church is a bit anti-astrology, and you wouldn't expect to go to a bishop and say, "Can I have some money to learn astrology, please?" And they go, "Oh, that's a good idea. There you go. Have £1,000." It
Mm,
wouldn't happen, but it
mm,
was happening then. The
mm.
church was very much in favour of it, and so
But
all
you have to
these.
get on the right side of the church and kings as well, because that's what happened to Herschel when he built his. I mean, he had his first telescopes that he made
Yes.
himself, but he built a great big one for the king of the time, and eventually it blew over or something. But he got sponsorship from the king, so he did all right. But he
Mm.
was a musician as well, so obviously, oh, okay, I'll have to carry on playing the harp, see if I can make some money doing that one, doing
Well,
astrology.
remember, Adelard of Bath taught astrology to King Henry II
Yes,
when
yeah.
he was a prince. So Henry II would have given him money to do that, and would have given
Gosh.
other astrologers money to do it. Now, meanwhile, the at Hereford they had a cathedral school, and it was something called a secular cathedral. That's a bit of a confusing term because we tend to think of secular as meaning atheist, and
Yes.
obviously cathedrals aren't atheist. But secular meant that instead of just teaching um, songs, because they had things called song schools where you teach priests and choir boys to sing mass,
Hmm.
they also had to teach priests grammar, and those schools became called grammar schools.
Oh my
Because
God, is that how grammar came
yeah,
about? I went to a grammar school.
because right from the 5th century onwards, when they were trying to convert all the pagans in England to
Yes.
Christianity,
Mm-mm.
they had to have priests coming over. They had to be able to say the mass. Well, to say mass, you need to know Latin.
Okay.
And they needed to learn Latin grammar. They needed to learn how to say it. They needed to know what it meant. The
Mm,
people taking part in it might not have had a clue what it meant,
mm,
but the priests had to know what it meant. So they had to teach them Latin. And they also had to teach them things like how to calculate Easter. So they had to do this rudimentary maths and rudimentary astronomy.
mm.
So some of these cathedrals were teaching the art of learning of calculating Easter. That was called computus, a bit
Okay.
like computing is where we get the word
Yeah, yeah,
computer.
yeah.
So they had to learn that, and they had to learn Latin grammar, and
Mm,
most of them just stuck to that. But Hereford was a bit wacky because it taught them astrology as well,
mm,
and it's quite strange how the different cathedrals differed. The guy that was um, one of the guys in Hereford, a long time before Roger, at the beginning of the 1100s, was a keen astrologer, and everyone thought that was perfectly normal in Hereford.
mm,
And he got promoted to Archbishop of York. And when he went to
mm.
York, they were absolutely horrified because this guy brought astrology books with him, and they thought that was evil. And when
Right.
he died, he went into the garden one day in York, and he was quite old, and they went to wake him up and he had died, and he had a copy of an astrology book with him. It was the Mathesis that I talked about earlier,
Mhm.
and the monks were so horrified that he had this black book of black magic, as far as they saw with him, they refused to bury him in the cathedral grounds. He was buried in
Wow.
consecrated grounds, and he was the
Mm,
bishop, sorry, the
mm,
Archbishop of York.
mhm.
It was considered absolutely outrageous, but it was perfectly
Wow.
normal in Hereford. So in the
Okay.
West Country, it was like, well, we don't mind these astrologers,
But
but
it's
we're not
still
having them
like
back in
that, the
York.
West Country. You say that the West, that was one of the reasons that I moved to this end of the world, because I lived in London
Mm,
and I had already started training in homeopathy. I was learning astrology on the side. And I came to the West Country and I loved the fact here that we had more alternative therapists per square inch than anywhere where
yes.
I was before. And that's still the case. We still very much, I mean, we call it the wacky West, but I still think that's still the case, actually. It's quite tolerated here.
If you
Yeah.
look on the AA's website for local groups, there are more local groups in the southwest than any other region. You've got Cornwall, you've got Plymouth, you've got Exeter, you've got Bath, you've got Bristol.
Mm,
You've got the if you go a little bit further up to the West Midlands, still west of England, you've got did have two Birmingham groups.
mm.
There was a Hereford group. There was a group in Glastonbury, although I don't think they're studying anymore. But there's a lot going on. And of course, Aquarius 7 in Cheltenham is one of the oldest
Yes,
groups. It started in
it's a
1981, I
lovely
believe.
group. Yeah,
So one
but
of
I
the
mean,
oldest
Glastonbury
groups in,
people
in the country.
expect Glastonbury, because it's sort of like a very pagan type of. This
Yeah,
is the village
absolutely.
Glastonbury, not the festival. But that's
Yes.
sort of the village, the city or town or whatever you want to call it. That's got all the hippy dippy shops and
Yeah.
whatever and remains of this and that and the other. Um, it is, yeah, quite a pagan thing. But it's funny how astrology's sort of stayed pagan. I mean, it hasn't. Well, actually, maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's not even pagan. It's sort of astrology stayed astrology, but in
Mm.
the UK, because it's much more popular in the US, but in the UK it's quite heretic type of thing, and it's on the. I mean, I used to be able to be interviewed on BBC, not
Mm.
anymore, because I've come now under the segment of their rules and regulations, which doesn't allow anything that comes under the banner of witchcraft, which I hasten to point out astrology isn't. Um, but it's not. It's sort of it's okay to write a horoscope for a newspaper or whatever, but it isn't to do a birth chart and to be serious about it. But that's suppression because people are so interested in it now. Yeah, people really, really
Mm.
are. And then you wonder why are people interested in it? It's the same reasons they've ever been interested in it. They want to know either about themselves or what is going to happen. That must have
Yes.
been the spark for all of these people, and your Roger chap to write all these books and to be doing all these translation stuff. There must have been
Mm.
like, maybe I can find out more. Yeah.
Well, we had the opposite problem with the states actually on at the AA because the Astrological Association is now a registered charity. So that was, you have to be quite socially acceptable to become a registered charity in this
Hmm.
country. But then when we wanted to start we're making a new website, and when we wanted to start taking payments using a system called Stripe, which is
Yes.
American, they
Uh-huh.
said, no, sorry, we've looked at your website and it goes against our terms and conditions. And
Hmm.
astrologers are finding it really difficult to use Stripe because they're saying, no, it's astrology's it's unacceptable to this
Oh, how
American
funny.
company. And
Oh,
Roy wrote
that's
to them and said, well, we're a registered charity and an educational charity. Nope, sorry,
how
we're not
funny.
touching you with a barge pole.
PayPal aren't bothered. They'll take money
No,
off anybody.
paper, right? Yeah. So in
Hmm.
Hereford, you then had this secular cathedral where they were quite keen on teaching astrology, and Roger was teaching these lads various things. He was teaching
Hmm.
them computus, and he wanted to teach them astrology. Now you've got to remember, for Roger, all this stuff was quite new. He was writing and teaching in about 1176, something like that. Some of these texts had only been translated 20 or 30 years beforehand, and it's not like a print run these days where you can spread it around really quickly. They all had to be copied by hand. So this
Hmm.
was new material. And he said, well, hang on, I've got Abu Mashar there, I've got Al Kabisi there, I've got Sal there, I've got Mashallah here. And my kids are, getting really confused about, well, where are these techniques coming from? So he said, so to satisfy the need for people to just be able to look it up in one place,
Yeah.
I'm compiling all these techniques that are available in diverse scattered sources into one volume. And this was his book,
Oh.
Judicial Astrology. And
Okay.
that's
So
why I
that would
call
have
it
been
the
a big
first.
thing then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this was the first astrology book in England. Okay, it was only horary astrology that he was looking at.
Hmm.
Um, and there would have been other texts as well. He doesn't tell you how to calculate a chart. He assumes you already know how to do that. But this book starts off with a reference section, all the basics. These are the planets, these are the signs. But
Hmm.
then he goes into the meat of his book, which is okay, this is how you do horary astrology. And
Oh.
this is where he says to his kids, the great thing about this is it lets you see into the future. and that gives you power over other people. That doesn't sound like a very Christian
No,
message.
it doesn't, does it?
But I'll tell you what, if you're a 13-year-old boy and somebody tells you you're going to get a lot of power by learning this stuff, you're going to knuckle down and learn it.
Mm,
So he
mm.
knew how to teach. He knew how to get their attention.
And did they? So they would have been making orrery charts then. Did they do the
Yeah.
circular ones or square ones? How would they have done them then?
Square ones are a lot easier to draw up,
Right.
and in some of the manuscripts, you've got to remember that we don't actually have Roger's original 12th century manuscript. Don't know where it is. It's not in
Oh,
Hereford Cathedral. Um, it got lost somewhere down the line. It'd be lovely if they rediscover it. We've got one that was written in the 13th century, probably about 20 or 30 years after Roger, a copy of it. So we've got lots of
right.
copies. We've got, I think it's
So somebody
26.
must have had the original and then
Yeah,
made their copy from the original, but that
yeah,
original's gone missing.
yeah.
Oh, maybe it'll turn up somewhere in someone's loft.
I
That'd be
hope
good.
so. That would
My
be
brother was an
fantastic.
antique book dealer, and he had a nose for these things. He'd go around to people's houses after whoever it was in the family had died, and he'd walk around the house and look at people's books and then give them a
Mm,
valuation and take all the books away. But he was so naughty. He'd always tell people that they were worth nothing, when in fact they were worth like millions of pounds. Or he'd give them sort of a reasonable amount of money, but that was his job as an antique book
yeah.
dealer. But he gave me quite a lot of books. Yeah, he's passed now, but he gave me quite a few interesting books. But books are funny things,
Mm,
because you assume that everything that's in a book is real and is correct and right, and then as you
mm.
get older you realize, well, actually some of that in there is just not true or lies or whatever. But then people must have been trusting books. Yes, he's
Yes.
Roger's writing this book and everybody's going to say, well, that is the word, so to speak,
Mm.
so therefore I'm going to follow it. Was that different attitude to books then?
Yes, I suppose so, but it was quite accurate. When you read Roger's stuff and then you compare it with the Arabic sources he got it from, he's made a pretty good fist of uh, compiling this into a single volume, and
Mm,
so did the earlier translators. Now, I don't really have Arabic, but people like Charles Burnett do, and people that have translated these things in modern times into English. It
mm,
means that we know that these are the Arabic sources. This is the translation, and then you look at Roger's text, and yeah, it's not Roger's text. He's taking
mm,
it from various Latin sources,
mm,
and these Latin translators got it pretty much more or less right. Where
mm.
you get errors are in tables, copying errors, where they put down 34 and somebody's written it down as 84 or something like that. And those sort of things, yes, you do get copying errors, and then you see it. So we've got 26 manuscripts, and some of them are
Mm,
copies for copies of copies, and
mm,
sometimes you'll see an error in there that's then being copied through into 6 different manuscripts. So
mm.
that helps you date them, and the
Okay.
handwriting helps you date them. So that's how you're able to look at it and go, that's a 13th century hand, that's a
Uh-huh.
15th century hand. And
Mm,
because we've got the internet, I mean, the last person to have written about this before me was a chap called Nick White, who did his master's thesis in Cambridge University in 91, I think. It was a long time ago. And I've been in touch with him, and he was only able to look at 2 manuscripts. Now, because of the internet and things being online and digital
mm.
photography, I've been able to look at all 26 manuscripts, because these
Wow.
days you go into a library, take out your phone,
Yeah.
photo, and then you can look at them at home, zoom into them, blow them up, and have a really close look. Nick couldn't do that. So I was able to look at it in a lot more detail and then date them and work out which ones came where and so on.
Hmm.
But this textbook was copied for a very long time, so it was obviously useful. But there's a bit of a mystery about it, because cathedral schools were the forerunners of universities. There weren't any
Okay.
universities in 1176.
Hmm.
Oxford was just about starting up, but it was very informal. It was like travelling scholars teaching a bit of stuff in their rooms to students. The university itself came around in the early 1200s, so a few decades afterwards, and we know that astrology was on the curriculum.
Mm.
We know it was being taught, but we haven't got any documents from the early universities saying, here's the curriculum. So we don't know which texts were being used. Was Roger's
Mm.
textbook, were these kids at his grammar school, did some of them go on to become lecturers at Oxford University? Were they using his textbook? We don't
Okay.
know. But we do know that a lot of university libraries ended up with it,
Hmm.
and we do know it was still being copied a couple of hundred years later. So it was obviously important enough to be copied over and over again,
Mm.
all over the place, in France, in Germany, in all over the UK. So it was obviously an important text, but we don't know who used it. and whether they were using Roger's text. So that's the mystery of Roger. He's a bit of a mystery man. We don't know very much about him. We know about his writings, but we don't know much about him. And there are
Don't
all
know what
sorts
time of the zodiac is or anything?
No, we know
No
nothing
birth
like that.
data?
Now, Hereford Cathedral say he was a famous astrologer and he travelled to Toledo to learn Arabic. But we got no evidence for that either. And I've been in correspondence with Chris Pullin, who's the deacon of Hereford Cathedral, and he said, "No, we don't really know that much about him. We thought he might have done that, and but we're not sure. He may never have moved out of Hereford. He may just have read these texts, translated them, and done that." Other texts say that he ended up moving to Bury St Edmunds and became a monk and died as a monk. But then another scholar said, well, no, his family have been in Hereford for generations and they're still there. Well, if he had a family, he couldn't have been a monk.
No, couldn't have been, unless he had an accident here or there.
I know, but then they wouldn't have boasted about it, so we wouldn't have known. But
no, we had that when my mum did, just to interrupt for a second, my mum did our family tree and came to Bath and went to the reference library to do it. So the family came over from Ireland to the UK in 1770. So she got all this info. And then she found one of the members of the family was paying a thing called a bastardy bond. And a bastardy bond was when you had a little accident with some poor girl and you had to carry on paying her some dosh because they had your child. Well, then my sister, after my mother died, my sister started doing the bastard side of the family, so the ones that were accidents.
Oh, right,
yeah.
Right.
So she rather than going down through the men's side of the family, she went down the girls' side of it. But all of those records are there. But when my mum found this, the woman that was helping her with the research was a proper researcher, the lady that was helping her, and she said, "Oh, we've discovered this bastardy bond." My mum could be a Catholic and all excited. How naughty was that? But yeah, it's very, very fascinating. My mum was totally into it. She loved doing family research because the whole written thing, and not like now. This is way before emails, and she was writing letters and people posting things to her, big chunks of paper. And it was produced as a book. Bath Central Library's got a copy of it. It's in about 3 libraries locally. But the whole thing about bits of paper and records and stuff and names being spelt wrong, it's amazing that anything gets to where we are today now.
Absolutely.
Because we just copy and paste and we can go to astro.com, make a chart, bing, as I keep saying, there's no way I could make a chart if I'd have to sit down there with a calculator doing it in my head.
But the family tree thing was quite interesting because just as I was finishing my PhD, I got this, what I assume was a rather wacky email from an American guy who said, "I'm the 23rd great-great-grandson of Roger of Hereford, so I was interested to hear your talk on it." And I thought, well, how do you know that? But he'd attached a copy of Burke's Landed Gentry from Victorian times, from I think it was 1860 or something like that. And it traced the entire genealogy of Roger, the famous philosopher, that's Roger of Hereford, right down to somebody who was called Lord Hereford in the 1850s. Well, I happened to be on Ancestry.com and I was able to track it down even further, right down to an actor who was in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Mark Hereford. And the Herefords are still there and they maintain that they are descended from the philosopher Roger of Hereford, and they've been in Mordiford, which is near Hereford, ever since then. And it's a stately home and it's open to the public twice a year. I was going to go this year, but I think that's probably a little bit out at the moment, but maybe next year. So it's fascinating stuff that it might be that Roger of Hereford really did
have kids,
and they're still there, still in Hereford to this day. Well, okay,
so
the actor lives in Los Angeles.
Did he train as a monk to start with then?
No, with the evidence that he was a monk now seems fairly flimsy. In secular cathedrals, you didn't have to take orders. You didn't have to be part of a monastery to be able to teach. So he was probably a school teacher. He was a school teacher teaching teenage boys about astrology, and they were all newfangled techniques. Not many people knew how to do astrology then. This is cutting edge stuff. He was in his school teaching boys how to cast charts, how to cast horary charts. And you look at his teaching style, and it's so modern. I've actually used his book to teach a little bit of horary astrology to the alumni of the Sophia Centre in Bath, the MA. And it's a modern technique because when you look at the Arabic texts, they're really long-winded. So you're going on a journey, say, and you want to know how is this journey going to be successful.
Mm.
Well, in an Arabic textbook, you go through all these pages, and there's questions relating to the first house, questions relating to this, and eventually you get questions relating to the ninth house. Will my journey be successful? All right, I'll look up that. It's almost like a book of case law. You know the stuff already. You're not being taught astrology. You're just reminding yourself, and it will say, look at the ruler of the ninth house, look at the moon, look at the ruler of the chart, and it's all a little bit complicated, but it tells you how to do it. Roger starts off really simply. You've got some kids in front of you, and you teach them astrology, and he goes, look, you know what a chart looks like, and this bit there is called the ascendant, and there's a planet that rules it. So let's say you've got an Aries ascendant. Mars is the ruler. That Mars is you. Now, every question that you can possibly ask is going to be represented by a house. If you're asking about marriage, that's the seventh house. If you're asking about kids, it's the fifth house. If you're asking about a long journey, it's the ninth.
Got you.
So let's say, is my journey going to be successful? Okay, well, look at the ninth house. Which planet rules the ninth house? Let's say that that's Sagittarius. Okay, well, Jupiter's the ruler. So your Mars, Jupiter is the journey. What's happening? Well, let's say that Mars and Jupiter are trine, or not quite trine, but Mars moves faster than Jupiter, and Mars is catching up. Yep, it's gonna meet Jupiter in a few days' time, and then you'll have that trine perfected. So that means when you're looking at this, yeah, look, Mars is rushing towards Jupiter. You are going on a journey. The symbolism's really simple.
Wow, that does make it easy.
And they go, yeah, that's great. And then he says, doesn't always work though, because maybe Jupiter, maybe there isn't an aspect, maybe Mars isn't rushing towards that, or maybe Jupiter's not in very good condition, so that would imply it's not a very good journey, so maybe you want something else instead. And then he starts bringing in, well, if you can't do that, try this, and he brings in all these rules bit by bit by bit and builds it up just like a modern teacher would do. And then he has this section on the intention. What's the intention of the person coming to see you? And you think, well, that's really confusing, because if somebody asks a question, they must know what their intention is. But let me give you an example. Let's say that you're an astrologer and somebody comes to you and says, my father's very ill and I want to know, will my father recover from his illness? That's a really sensible, horary question. It's a question about an illness. So it's a sixth house question. However, it might be that the person doesn't give a damn whether, doesn't
they want to know if they're going to inherit.
And his real question is, when am I going to get my inheritance? When am I going to get my hand on dad's dosh? So he gives you techniques of what's the actual intention? Forget the question. What do they really want to know? And that's quite clever stuff. And he gives lots and lots of rules for this. And then he says to his students, look, I know this seems confusing because I've just given you 6 completely contradictory rules, but that's how astrology works. You do get all these things and you look at each of them. And if 3 of them are telling you the same story, that's what it's about. So you look for what he calls testimonies that agree with each other. Imagine a court case. You've got 6 witnesses. 2 of them are a bit dodgy, but 3 or 4 of them agree. So, okay, that's probably the one that you're going to be looking at. And astrology is like that. And one thing that really threw me for a long time is he's got one technique there for the intention, which says the intention is blah, blah, blah. And the hidden thing is, and he lists it, the hidden thing is a piece of white twisted wool, or the hidden thing is a bat's head or a bird of 2 colours. And you think, well, okay, the mysterious case of the missing bat's head, what on earth is that about? And I'm very grateful to Ben Dykes, who's translated a lot of text into English recently, a traditional astrologer, who said, no, it's called a tester. Lily used to do it as well. You've come to see me, the astrologer. And I say to you, yeah, Mary, you've got a wart on your left buttock. Now, I can't possibly know that because I've never met you before. And you're presumably wearing clothes, so I can't see that you've got a wart on your left buttock, but you have. And the fact that I know that means, blimey, this bloke's a good magician, isn't he? He knows stuff about me that only I can know, and yet he knows it. That means he must be good. And this is what Roger was doing. The bat's head could be a lucky charm that somebody had. So somebody comes to see him and he goes, yes, that's interesting. I wonder if you have a bat's head on your person, or perhaps something, a feather of 2 colours from a bird. And they'll go, well, actually, yes, I do have this shriveled bat's head as my lucky charm in my purse. So Gosh,
Wow.
well, good. You must be the right person to ask.
Uh,
So he has this section on finding hidden things, and
mm.
William
And would he
Lilly
use that
did
in a
that years
consultation,
later.
like you say? So he'd say to the person straight up, you know, I've got this thing I know about you that you don't know that I know, but I do know.
Yes. Well,
Whoa.
William Lilly did this in the
Yeah.
1600s. Roger doesn't say that's what it's for, but that would be the implication, that that's why you want to know. Why else would you be asking about a hidden thing? And modern astrologers often do the same thing, because you might be doing a natal reading for somebody, but
Mm.
you might also draw up a chart for the time of the consultation. Have a
Yes,
look
I've
at
done a
that.
podcast on that, and I do that. Yeah, and
So
that's
you do
Adrian
that,
Duncan I got
and
that
that's
from.
your consultation chart, and you go, oh, they're going to be a bit argumentative, aren't they? Look at that, we got Mars square so and so, and yeah, okay. So you're on, you're aware of how it might go, and they might not like what you're going to say to them.
Mm.
You can't really do that with horary, because they turn up and say, where's my lost wedding ring? And you draw
Mm.
up a chart for now. Well, that is also the consultation chart. It's going to be the
That's true.
same chart.
Yeah.
So what Roger does is says there's one set of techniques. You're looking at the same chart through two different angles. One of them is the usual horary chart that we use to answer the question, and the other is looking at different elements of that chart to determine what the intention is. And he gives all the techniques for that. Things like
Mm.
Lord of the Hour. And there are all sorts of quite fancy techniques for
Mm.
determining the intention. And he
Mm.
writes about that. So he's teaching these kids, this is how to do a consultation, and
Mm.
this is how to find out what's really going on.
So, do we know if any of his students actually ended up being astrologers and they've written books? I mean, is there a sort of ancestry of his students?
This is what I was desperate to. I spent 8 years trying to find out, and just
Oh,
drew a blank
eight
on all of it.
years. Oh
We
my
don't know.
God.
We just don't know.
So
These
you wouldn't say I'm a student of Roger, you know, on your.
No,
Oh
these
my.
the trouble is we don't have you. What we would love is early university records, and they don't exist. We don't have a curriculum until the 14th century, and we know that universities have been going for nearly 200 years by then. And we
Mm.
know that they were teaching Alcabis's Introduction to Astrology was the classic text in universities in the 14th century.
Mm.
But what was being used in the early 13th century when Oxford started? It may have been Roger's book, but we
Mm.
just don't know. We've got
But
no
was his
proof
book
of
probably more widely used than other things? I mean, who was he? Who was his competitor? So he's got his book, which was called. Remind me, what was his book
Judicial
called?
Astrology. Well,
Judicial. Yeah. Was there
books
a
didn't
competing book?
books didn't have titles. This is why it's been really confusing tracking these
What?
manuscripts down, because you launch into it. So it says the whole thing starts off with an introduction,
Uh-huh.
and the introduction. I'll just pull it up. The introduction, of course, it's all in Latin.
Mm.
So it starts off but it's in Latin. But it starts off saying the rules of judicial astrology can be found in many diverse places. So
Yeah.
some catalogers say, okay, we're putting this as quoniam regulis artis astronomicae, blah blah blah, and they put that in the catalogue as that. Others will put it in as the art of astrology. Others will put it in as something else, because there isn't a title as such. You have
They
a
did
prologue that starts off.
What's the matter with them? Well, they didn't, did they? Because the Bible didn't have a title either.
No, there's no
A title.
title to the Bible, is there?
No.
So some people put it in as in the beginning, and some people might call it Genesis, and so on. So
Yeah, if you've got any friends that are librarians, I've got loads because we did the Safe Bath Library campaign and I follow them all and
yes, yes.
and my sister-in-law was a librarian for a while, and the whole categorizing things, the category that something has to go into, and also when it's they tend to take the out and then do the next bit and whatever, and also this funny way of
Yeah.
doing things, and that can make it, because we just think we'll Google it, but that's not how library categories are done, or books are, or anything. And these are things you've got to learn when you write a book, mind, because you need to check that you go into the right category. Because there's it's the thing that naughty people do, is they stick their book into a category that isn't very used on Amazon. I don't know, like history of eggs or something. They'll stick their book in that category, and therefore they'll become a bestseller. And that category,
Yes,
there's all these crafty things that people can do.
absolutely,
But the
yeah.
whole categorizing of things. Sorry, go on. I'm interrupting you. Carry on.
So no, he didn't have a title as such,
Right.
and so we do know that it was copied widely. And when you look at some of the manuscripts, they've got scribblings in. So this is where people have annotated them. So we know they were used as teaching texts. Some of them, one of them in particular, a French one, has got margin notes that Roger will give a sentence about something, and the margin note will say Abu Mashar 3:18. And when you look at book 3, chapter 18, the Abu Mashar goes into much more detail about it. So here's something that Roger's written, summarising in a couple of sentences, and the people annotating it have said, yeah, if you want the full details, this is where to get it from. It was clearly used as a teaching text.
But there were no other texts that were similar at that moment in time?
No, because the other texts, remember, they hadn't been translated. They hadn't been translated for very long. So yes, you had Al-Kabisi's Introduction to Astrology, which was a teaching text in Arabic in Islamic countries from 900 onwards, but and the Latin version was there, and that was fine. That told you something. So some people were doing it from there, but it wasn't actually that accessible. It was kind of a reference book. And you normally have a reference book when you already know the subject. So you might have read through this, you might be quite a good astrologer, and here's Al-Kabisi's book. Doesn't tell you how to do astrology, it just assumes that you know that, and it's more an aide memoir. Roger was writing a textbook for kids, and that was the first textbook.
13 to 14-year-olds were learning astrology.
We don't know this for sure, but we do know that undergraduates that started at Oxford 30 years later started at 14, did a 7-year course, and graduated when they were 21. So undergraduates would have been a lot younger than they are today.
Well, mind you, people didn't live as long either, did they?
No. But yeah, they graduated at the same age. So you graduate at 21 today. It's just you do a 3-year course.
Okay.
And in those days, you did a 7-year course, and you started off by learning the trivium, the 3 ways. It's where we get the word trivia or trivial from. And the 3 ways were rhetoric, grammar, and logic.
Okay.
And that was the basis. That's like your reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Yeah.
Then you went on and specialised in the quadrivium, the 4 paths. And that was the various scientific subjects, including astrology. So there was music, mathematics, astronomy, astrology, and can't remember what the 4th one was, but it was something scientific.
Maths.
And so that was they were the 3 paths and the 4 paths, and that's what you learnt in your 7 years at university.
Okay.
And you started university at 14. So we can assume that the grammar school kids would have been, 12, 13, 14. And they'd have been ready to move on to greater things then.
And then when they get to 21, what sort of job would they have had at the end of it? So having gone to this type of school, what would you qualify to be able to do?
Well, you might become a teacher yourself. You might become a doctor. You might become a priest. So medics, doctors had to learn astrology right up until the 1700s. So you definitely needed to know your astrology because you'd cast charts for when the patient took to their bed, was so ill they had to take to their bed. You have this decumbiture chart, as it's called.
I love that idea. And I still ask people that now. That's in a homeopathic consultation.
Yes,
When did it start? Because we have a thing called never been well since. So, well, that's different, but that's slightly different. But we've got the etiology of it. When did this start? And there's another thing in homeopathy called never been well since. So I had chickenpox when I was 6, and I've had asthma ever since. But that is that's never been well since I had, or I don't know, my father fell out of the car, or I fell off a bus or whatever at that age. Never been well since. Yeah, okay. Decumbiture. Yeah, I like that one. When does it start? Because you do a chart for that. So it's pretty complex stuff. So you get to 21, you've learned all this, Roger's been your man that's been teaching you and stuff. But then we've got no info too much about the man himself when he must have that's just crazy,
well,
isn't it?
It's quite common. You see, medieval authors tended to be very modest because these days you want to be famous for publishing something that nobody's done before. In medieval times, they go, well, I don't care what Mary says, it's just a load of rubbish. If you come up with a brilliant idea and say, this isn't my idea, Aristotle said this, people go, well, if Aristotle said it, it must be good. And so they would often attribute things to ancient Greek authors that just weren't written by them at all. So, and Ptolemy said, well, no, he didn't. You said it. But in order to get your book published, you pretended that Ptolemy said it, and people took it seriously. Whereas if you said, Robert of Salisbury said so and so, people go, who the hell's Robert of Salisbury? I don't care what he says. But if Robert of Salisbury comes up with something and claims that Ptolemy said it, people will read it. And you often end up with these very modest introductions saying, I'm not worthy of penning these words, but I offer this humbly and so and so and so. And so they don't really get down as being famous in their own right, and we don't really know what we know what they wrote, but we don't
Yeah.
really know much about their reception. And
Mm.
there is a couple of hundred years of history missing in the university archives from about 1200s onwards, which is a real shame because we
Missing
would
as it
love.
because it wasn't recorded, or missing as in the place burnt down?
Well, no, probably missing because it was recorded on scraps of parchment that we just don't
Ah.
have anymore. So it would be lovely to say, here's the first curriculum of Oxford University, but we don't have it. It's a real shame. So the
Because
man
that's the whole.
remains a mystery.
This is the whole thing about history, though. Anyway, isn't it? There's a limit to what we can find out. I mean, there's different stuff that gets suppressed and whatever. Like you say, the medieval ages are the dark ages, but there's all this stuff going on. So why are we saying that nothing happened during the
Yeah.
medieval era?
Well, I think
Is that
these
just schools
days,
getting it wrong, or?
well, we're a little bit more culturally aware these days. You can't say in a school nothing happened when one of the world's major religions came into existence during that time.
Mm,
We don't ignore the rise of Islam now, but we
mm,
certainly did when I was a kid at school. It was
mm,
like not a lot happened because the only important stuff is Western European history. Who cares what happens elsewhere in the world? That was the prevailing attitude in the 60s.
mm,
It was all very Eurocentric and Christian centric.
mm.
Unfortunately, we've moved on a bit from that now.
Hurrah. Mm.
But the 12th century is a fascinating period. It's also when we learned how to build cathedrals properly, because before that they were all quite squat structures. Whereas if you think about the beautiful domes you get in Islamic architecture,
Mm.
and the Romans were able to build these, building a dome. Imagine having a Lego set and trying to build a domed building. It's a lot more difficult than building a square building. And we had
Absolutely.
lost the ability to do that. You need a bit of maths to be able to do it.
Hmm.
Um, and so we discovered these architectural secrets in the 12th century, and then we were able to start building really beautiful cathedrals that we couldn't
Well,
do
because
before.
Bath
But what happened
Abbey.
in the 12th century?
Yeah, because Bath Abbey got started being built in 1100 and something. I mean, it took
Mm.
600 years to build it. And just think, can you
Yes.
imagine? I am inheriting this job.
Mm.
I've got to take it on, and there's been 50 people before me that have built this flipping thing. We can. What was that hospital they did in China for the virus, and they put it up together, and it was built in 3 or 4 days or something. It's
Yeah.
just like unheard of. Mind you, we got steel, so things a bit different then.
Yeah.
Um, but I thought the whole thing about the building. So were those some of those techniques imported as well? We
Oh
didn't
yeah,
know
yeah. A
that.
lot of these were. It was Arabic science that was imported, and
Well,
a lot of medical texts as well. There's a lovely
okay.
story during the Crusades, because this is the other thing that seems weird. You think, why is the church promoting Muslim writings? Well, they didn't really see them as Muslim. There's nothing in these astrology texts telling you that you should, that you should worship Allah and that Muhammad's his prophet.
Mm,
They saw them as, oh well, the Arabs, they might be Muslim themselves, but they're taking these ancient texts and
right.
translating them.
So
And
even further back. Mm,
even though those ancients were pagan, you
mm,
can't. If you're a Christian, you can't really blame Aristotle for not being a Christian because he lived and died before Christ.
mm,
So that was all right. And people like Plato had this idea of a soul and as prime move, and Aristotle had the idea of a prime mover. So it sounds monotheistic. It sounds as though Aristotle is talking about one God. And
mm.
so it wasn't that unacceptable to the Catholic Church. It was like, obviously they couldn't have accepted Christ because this all happened before Christ, but they did
Mm.
understand that there weren't lots of different Greek gods. They subscribed to a philosophy that
Yeah,
said
because
there's
that's what
one
cheesed them off.
prime
They
mover.
had more than one god.
Mm.
Yeah, in it.
So Aristotle was perfectly acceptable amongst Christians and amongst Muslims, and so was Plato, because Plato had the idea of a soul descending to earth. So the whole Christian notion of the soul comes from Plato.
Is
So
it?
that was all right. Yeah, the myth
Okay.
of Er.
All
It's
right, I'll have
worth
to
looking
check
that
that
up.
out.
That's the
Okay, we'll
story of
do.
how souls transmigrate and so on.
Hmm.
So yeah, Plato and Aristotle, that was fine, and the Arabs were translating it, so that was fine as well. So even though we were like in the middle of the Crusades when this was going on, it was all right. And there were cultural exchanges even during the Crusades.
Right, so
So
just stop there for a second, just so listeners know what were the Crusades in just a couple of sentences. What was that all about? Who
there were
was
lots of them.
crusading where?
But the
Mm,
first crusade started in the 11th century, the 1000s,
mm,
where they knew that the Muslim armies were on the move. They were expanding into places like Spain. In the year 760, they almost sacked parts of France as well. So there
mm,
was a lot of hostility between Christianity and Islam,
mm,
and eventually a pope, to boost his popularity, decided that he was going to recapture Jerusalem, which had been taken over by the Muslims. This was the Christian holy city,
Mm-hmm.
and he got lots of people turned up to this talk, this speech that he gave, tens of thousands of them, and they were just ordinary people who were fired up by him and marched towards Jerusalem. I mean, most of them just got completely massacred on the way because they were
Killed
just
on the way.
farmers and peasants and so on. And there were nobles as well that went out. And that was the first crusade. And then I think there was a second, a third, a
And
fourth, a fifth
does
crusade. They went over
crusade have
hundreds
a
of years.
meaning? The word crusade, does it mean something?
I don't know what the
Right.
etymology of it is
Mm-hmm.
actually, but we still talk about going on a crusade as, fighting for some ideal. And
Got
it's
you.
usually portrayed as Christianity taking on Islam.
Yeah,
But it
goodies
wasn't
and
like that at
baddies.
all, because actually what happened is the Christian nations were heavily split, so were the Muslim nations. And so you would end up with, a Christian king from
Mm-hmm.
one country working with a Muslim caliph from another, beating the crap out of another Christian country or another Muslim country. So sometimes, and people would switch sides all the time. So it wasn't really as clear cut as Christianity versus Islam. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, one of the Crusades, they were supposed to be capturing Jerusalem, but they decided that they go and sack Byzantium on the way because that was a really rich Christian country. So you had all these Christian crusaders smashing up Christian cities and looting them. Well, that wasn't supposed to be what it was about. And then they
Oh.
went on their way, and
Mm.
they did recapture Jerusalem in the end, but not for very long. And it was all a very confused time, and there were lots of different alliances. So yes, you would have Muslim rulers fighting each other. You did have Christian rulers fighting each other, and sometimes you'd have very unusual allies. So you'd have a Christian ruler employing a Muslim army to help beat up another Christian ruler.
So it was quite religion orientated then, the wars they were having against each other.
Allegedly, yeah, but
Oh.
it was the excuse. It was
Oh,
it
but
was
it's more
really
a power
it was a
thing.
power grab,
Right. Yeah.
and you do a power grab by saying God wants you to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the other thing was you weren't Christianity said you weren't allowed to kill, but because it was a holy crusade and the Pope had said it was all right, that
Mm.
meant that actually, if you killed, you hadn't committed a mortal sin. You were all
Mm.
right because the Pope had said you could because you were doing it in God's name.
Wow.
Now,
Pope
you were
had
going to
quite
get
a bit
very,
of
very,
power
very
then.
rich in the process if you didn't
Mm-hmm.
get killed yourself. So
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't really in God's name. It was because you wanted a power grab and you wanted loads of money. But
And
uh,
would the Pope pay you if you were successful with your crusade?
well, you ransacked places, so you got your money that way, and you paid some of it to the church, of course, and so they
Mm.
got rich in the process as well, and so did various kings. So it was a very messy period. But there
But
is
people
a
did give money to popes. I'm sorry to interrupt you
They
there.
did,
People
yeah,
did.
yeah.
My great 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 auntie, the Countess Isabella English, got her title Countess. She was a member of the English family, and there were too many kiddies. I don't know whichever relative it was. She had too many kids. So some other family said, "Oh, we really like your daughter Isabella. We'll adopt her." So our family went, "Yeah, great idea." Off she goes and lives with this other family. They pop it. They're rich. She gets left all this money, and she was told that she needed in the will that had to spend it on good causes, Catholic ones obviously. So she
Mm.
converted and became a nun and went all over the place. She paid money for the building of one of the St John the Evangelist in Bath. She chipped in some money. Her name's on the wall. But she went out to Italy and saw the Pope and gave him a couple of bob as well. And then he went, "Oh, thanks very much for the dosh. Here's the title Countess." So she comes back to the UK. She's now got the title. It's a papal Countess, which is
Mm.
different from Countess. She had the title. My mother, when she found this in the family history, she was really chuffed. But because she'd given him some money, not because she had done some good deeds, I suppose. She bought a few, what do you call them, altars and stuff,
Mm.
paid for some schools and whatever. But she got the title because she'd given some money to him. Do you know what I mean? And she made a
Absolutely.
pilgrimage to do it and all the rest of it. And so when you're saying that, it's like I was thinking, well, yes, that did happen. And that's not in my living memory, but
Mm.
recorded within my family. It's just
Well,
like,
things like the
wow.
sale of indulgences, you give a lot of money to the church, then you get time off in purgatory.
Yes, and
So
you're
it's always,
given.
churches
Mm.
have always been about power grabs from the very earliest days, really. But there's one story of a crusader, because they weren't always at each other's throats. There was a Frankish knight, that was a crusader knight, a Christian knight, in Spain, had been injured and broke his leg, and an Arabic doctor came along, or a Muslim doctor came along, and he bound the leg, just as we'd do today, and he gave him some medicine to reduce his fever, because he had a fever, and that was fine. That's exactly what we do today, and it was kind of working all right. And then another Christian knight came along and said, no, 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 he's got an imbalance of humours and needs to be. And so he stuck a sword in his head to try and release some of the pressure. And of course, the knight died. And
Oh,
the
I
Arabic
wonder why.
doctor just said, I learnt a lot about Frankish medicine that day.
Oh, we can laugh though, but that must be awful. What? Oh my goodness. Okay. So, Chris, this is really, really interesting. We could go on forever. We're going to have to slow down soon, and we're going to tie up if we can. So, Roger's book's available online.
No, I think I'm the first person to have translated it all.
Oh.
And my thesis is available online. And I haven't translated it, I haven't put an exact translation in there, but I have paraphrased every section of it. So you can get the gist of it. It is a bit of a dry, heavy read. I kind of did an astrologer friendly version of my thesis originally,
Mm.
and it was considered too astrologer friendly and not wordy and dusty and academic enough, so I kind of had to redo it.
Uh-huh.
So I am going to try and get an astrologer friendly version out there. But at the
Uh-huh.
moment, my thesis is available freely online in the Leicester Research Archive.
Great. So if you give me the link to that, and I can put that on the podcast. Yes.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
I'll email
Okay.
you that.
Uh-huh. And uh, so you've said here that there's lots of astrology books that have been written in the last 2,000 years before and after Roger. So why is this one the most important, or in your view, why is it? Because it was the only one that was available, or
It was the first astrology book written, I'd say, in England, possibly in Europe as a
right?
textbook. We don't have any similar ones. There was a Scottish person called Michael Scott who ended up working in a court in Bohemia, but he was
Hmm.
a little bit later. He also wrote a textbook and taught astrology. And we have people like Guido Bonatti, who was the most famous astrologer of his time, but he was in the 1300s, and
Right.
he wrote the Book of Astronomy, also based on Arabic sources. He doesn't
Mm,
credit Roger, so we don't know whether he ever heard of Roger or not. But
mm,
as I say, it's quite possible that Roger's text, being copied around, would have
mm,
had techniques used from it, and they wouldn't have known who the author was because it was just being copied around and it was a textbook. If you think
mm.
about it today, everybody's heard of J.K. Rowling,
Yeah,
everybody's heard of Albert Einstein, but the people that write
mostly.
textbooks about
Mm,
relativity at universities, you won't have heard of them, and I won't have
that's
heard of
true.
them.
Yeah.
So teachers don't tend to become famous. They're the ones
No.
that are passing the information on. But if you're
Mm.
writing a textbook, Roger didn't claim to do anything original. He said, look, I've got these techniques, they're all from different
Yeah, he's doing a
places.
translator
And
type of thing.
he
Mm.
was putting them together into a textbook. When you collect other people's information and put it in a digestible form, you're doing
Mm.
a great service to people, but you don't become famous from
Well,
doing
it's a
that.
bit like Reader's Digest, even. The
Yes,
whole
yeah,
idea that you're making it more freely available, or what's another word? I think people write books that are collections of stuff, or yeah, you're what's the word? You're making it more easily available, but you recognize you haven't written it yourself, but you're bringing
yes.
stuff in. But even so, so. Okay, one last question. So, when you started doing your research, did you do a chart for that moment that you started?
No, because it was there wasn't a single. I suppose the single seminal moment, and I should have done a chart for it. Really,
Mm.
was when Bernadette Brady said to me, "Have you seen this thesis that's a master's dissertation that's online from Nicholas White? He's written this book about somebody called Roger of Hereford." And this guy invented loads of brand new techniques because that was Nick White's conclusion. He said, well, these techniques, I haven't seen these anywhere else before. But
Mm.
that's because Nick was writing in 1991, and a lot of the Arabic texts hadn't been translated into English at that
Mm.
point. Um, and so now we know, we get this thing about the bird of two colours and the bat's head. That sounds so wacky. It had to be Roger's own invention. But actually, no, we can find that there in a Greek text that has only been translated relatively recently. Some of the other things that seem to be of Roger's own devising, according to Nick White, we can now see, no, actually, that was in Saul, but that was only translated by Ben Dykes a few years ago.
Mm. Mm.
So
Mm.
Nick didn't have the advantage of this huge corpus of medieval astrology books that we now have in the, uh, well, from about 2005 onwards.
Mm.
Um, in the 90s, we had very few medieval astrology books. It was just starting.
So, can you remember that date
Katrina
that
Mundell, who
Bernadette
comes to your
Brady's
group, was the
right?
first person to actually publish William Lilly.
Who?
Katrina, do you know Katrina Mundell? She comes along to your group. It's spelled Catriona, but pronounced Katrina.
Oh, I don't go to the group.
Ah, right. She goes to the Bath Astrology group. She
I
lives in
haven't been for
Bath.
ages because it coincides with choir practice. I can't be in two
Ah,
places at
well,
once. Yeah.
she's lived in Bath for a long time, and she's responsible for pulling William Lilly out of the shadows in England, and being responsible for publishing the first copy of Christian astrology that he did in the 1600s.
Oh,
So there's another Bath connection with astrology.
yeah.
But
But the date
it's
Bernadette Beatty said that to you, did you note that down?
I didn't note the date when she said that, no, and I should be able to. It was at a conference
Dig it
somewhere, so I should
out.
be able to
Dig it
work it
out.
out. But she suggested it, and then I started looking, and I was going to do it at Bath Spa University as it was then,
Yes, and
and
that's as well, yeah.
and Nick said, "Well, actually, I'm full of PhD students at the moment. Not," and he said, if you're moving up to Leicester, why don't you see what's going on there?" And I thought, well, you can't just knock on the door of a university and say, "Hello, can I do an astrology PhD, please?" They'll go, "Yeah, of course, come on in."
Mm.
But my partner found that there was, after I'd moved to Leicester, said, "Look, there's a whole series of talks being given on the space age by people from the university, and most of them were astrophysicists and scientists. But
How
one
did
of
he
them,
know that?
sorry,
How did he know that?
because it was he works at the university."
Oh, he works at the uni. Right,
Yeah.
okay. Mhm.
And he said, "Look, there's a flyer." And he brought home this flyer and said, "Look, there's a whole list of talks going on." And slap bang in the middle of it, one of the talks, it was nothing to do with the space age, was the medieval cosmos and zodiac men. And it was a talk by uh, Richard Jones, who was an archaeologist but had an interest in medieval stuff.
Mm.
So I emailed him and I said, "Look, I've done an MA at Bath Spa University. I'd really like to do this, and your talk sounds fascinating, and I'm going to come along and listen to it, and I'd really like to talk to you afterwards."
Mm.
He emailed back and said, "No, no, no, don't come to my talk. I can assure you it will be a triumph of presentation over content, because I don't really know very much about medieval astrology." But actually, he knows a lot more than he lets on about medieval astrology. He was absolutely brilliant, and he met me afterwards, and he'd gone through and he'd spoken to loads of people, and he said, "I've spoken to a few of the astrophysicists. They're bigots, aren't they?" He said they were so anti-astrology. I couldn't believe it.
Mm.
He was really enthusiastic about it, and so he became my supervisor, and I'm very
Right.
glad he was. He was a brilliant supervisor,
So the
and I was
uni took it on.
yeah,
As a,
and I was a
right.
bit worried about, because he said, "Well, I'm not very eminent. You'll probably," and I said, "No, no, I want you as my supervisor," and he was absolutely brilliant. And I was always a bit wary about, in academia, you've got to be a bit careful about saying you're an astrologer. But as soon as I started, there were other when it's like, "What's your PhD about?" And I thought everyone was going to roll their eyes. It was, "Oh, I'm doing magic symbolism in snakes on church doors in Rutland," and, "Oh, I'm doing so and
Whoa.
so." And the whole of this department, it was English local history, were all a
Uh,
little bit wacky, and it was
uh.
brilliant.
And
And
has all of this
and
been
Richard
under,
said to me
well,
on one of our
Neptune's?
supervising
Yeah.
meetings, he said, "Look, I know you're too busy to do this, but I did have a word with my mum, and
Uh,
my time of birth is so and so." And I was well, he gave me his birth
uh,
details, and I did a little chart for him.
and has all of this been going on while Neptune's been in Pisces?
Well, because I've been doing medieval astrology, I've been ignoring the outer planets. I started
Mm.
in 2011, and
Right.
I graduated in 2019. Well,
Okay.
actually, yeah, I graduated in 2019, and the graduation ceremony was January 2020.
Because we're halfway through almost the Neptune transit. I'm
Yeah.
just wondering when it started. I don't know. Hold on. I'll just firing up my computers. I know you don't do, because this is the thing with medieval astrology, you don't do the outer planets, but I do, because I find them
I mean, I
fascinating.
do when I'm doing client work, but the trouble
Yes,
is, I've been so involved in this for the last 8 years. I haven't done any client work for 8 years.
I'm
I
sure you
do
haven't had
use
any
the output.
time.
Exactly. Yeah. So no,
It's a
I
lengthy
do
thing you've
use them,
done.
but
Because you came to our group and you did a whole presentation on medieval astrology, and you dressed up in your medieval
that's
clothes.
right.
It was
Yeah, yeah,
amazing. It was really good. Oh, and the group was like, because I was just teaching a few little astrologers then, and because I used to do that face to face, and you came around and you had the whole gear on that you were wearing, and you were talking about, it's amazing. It was interesting. Yes, around about 2010, 2011. I mean, this is not accurate, this computer program I'm
yeah.
doing. Round about, that's when Neptune went into Pisces.
Well, I
So you
started in October 2011.
hold on. October 2011.
So pulling up the
Yes.
chart for that,
Yeah.
Neptune was
Ooh.
at 23 of Aquarius,
Yeah, it is coming to the end.
and it had just gone retro. It was retrograde as well.
Retrograde.
So
Yeah.
yeah, So that's when I
Mm.
started.
Yeah, so you've done most of this under the Neptune transit in your own sign.
Yeah. Well, you see, I don't use Neptune as ruling Pisces. I use Jupiter as
Oh, you
ruling
used to, yeah,
Pisces.
yeah.
I do use Neptune, but I don't use the outers as rulers.
No, you won't. That would be wrong. Thank you very much, Chris, for coming to chat to us today. I
Well,
really do
thank you very
appreciate
much,
it.
Mary.
It's been really interesting. So what we'll do is we'll put a link to your dissertation at
Yeah.
the uni, yeah? And do you want people to be able to contact you if they've got questions from today
Yeah,
or not?
absolutely.
Yeah, so if I
Absolutely.
put
Yeah.
your email address onto the podcast
Put the
show
email
notes.
address on as well. Yeah. And
Excellent.
I'll email you the link, the Leicester Research Archive link, which is where my thesis is. So
Fabulous. So I'm going to turn this off and then we'll carry on chatting in a minute. But thanks very much. So thank you very much for listening today. It's Learn Astrology with Mary. You can find me at www.maryenglish.com and we'll be back next week. Thank you. Bye bye now.